Okay.
Morning.
Good morning. Oh, I can't.
Apologies. A little bit of IT issues this morning and screens not working and the rest of it. So,
Okay, Mark, I think we've gone to live now. Live stream started. Sophie's just confirmed live stream started.
smashing.
Yeah.
Good morning, all. I think everything's working and we're started. Can we just have the apologies first, please?
Okay. I've received apologies from Mark Vickers, Helen Brooks, substituted by Adrian Miller, Councillor Christine Whelan, and Alison Anderson. On officers, I've received apologies from Martin Perbrick and Martin Wade.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by welcoming those members of the public and press who are watching the live stream of this meeting via the Council's website. Minutes of the meeting will be produced in the usual way, and a recording of the meeting will be available to view on the meeting page of the Council website. To enable the meeting to run in an orderly manner, I'd ask all members of the forum who have video cameras to keep their video cameras switched on for the duration of the meeting and to keep their microphone muted, except when I invite you to speak. Officers will join us to introduce their reports in the same way. Any members wishing to ask questions or make a comment should indicate this by clicking the raised hand function on the right-hand side of your screen. When the chair invites you to speak, please unmute your microphone, ask your question, and then mute on. I'd ask for your patience if we run into technical problems, and should this occur, our broadcast will be paused. If it is not possible to address the fault, the meeting may be abandoned in such a time as it can be reconvened. Thank you. Any member wish to disclose any pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest? No, not seeing anybody doing that. Thank you. Okay. So first off, we'll go to the minutes of last time and just agree those for accuracy. I'll go through the minutes page by page. Please raise your blue hand if you wish to raise a point of accuracy only. So we'll start making our way through them. Sorry, I'm having fun with screens, so I've now got to find the right one on my other screen. So if you just hold on one moment, we'll work our way through the minutes of last time. So page 1. No. Page 2. Page 3. Page 4. Page 5. Page 6. 7. 8. 9. I believe we're now finished. So I didn't see anybody raise a hand at that point. Excellent. Thank you very much. So I think we can take those as passed, Tamar. Turn to the action log. Do officers have any further updates on ongoing actions that are not covered in the rest of the agenda? No, that's good as well. Okay. So moving on. I believe we are now reaching review of the membership and proportionality. Tamar, can you introduce the report? And again, I'll ask anybody who wishes to ask any questions to raise your hand.
Okay, thank you. So very briefly, we have 7 maintained representatives, 13 academies representatives, 1 representative for the early years reference group and 1 for the post-16 FE. So that's 22 voting members on the board at the moment. And looking at the figures, we propose that there's no further changes to proportionality. In terms of the appointments for review, we have 3 appointments that where terms of office were coming to an end: Mark Vickers, Leslie Birch, and Corinne Taylor. Mark and Karen have already confirmed they'll be stepping down from the forum, and we've also Peter Law also confirmed that he will be stepping down from the forum at the end of the academic year. So there'll be a number of vacancies to fill. So that will elections for the vacancies will be ahead of the November school forum. I think that was everything.
For clarity, I believe we've had a conversation and we just need to work out how we're going to manage the academy alternative provision. But I think Ryan has put his hand up to suggest that he would happy to be fulfilling that role.
Yeah.
Ryan?
Yeah.
Yeah. You're muted, sir.
Yes, that is correct.
Cool. So we'll just need to double check that. And the others, as they're all academy appointments, John Colpin, I haven't been out to see if John, but if John is there, I think he knows anyway, that will come down to the CEOs group as the responsible bodies making that selection. So hopefully John will be able to arrange that and ensure that we have the right number of people for the meeting in future.
Yeah, that's fine. And I'll make sure that I contact John with the information.
Super. Thank you very much indeed. Okay. If there are no other questions around that, we'll move on to the High Needs Monitoring Working Group update. Ryan and Sarah, could you introduce the report, please?
Yep, I think, Mark, Ryan's going to take us through the update and then I'll go through the LA response, if that's okay.
Absolutely fine. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's fine with me as well. So if I make a start. So obviously the group was set up by Forum to bring together system leaders and local authority colleagues to try and address, make recommendations regarding the overspend for the high needs block. I think it's really clear to emphasise that the role of the groups was to do exactly that, to make recommendations that the local authority would consider and look to implement for September 26 or within the 25-26 academic year. The one area that needed more urgent attention was the behaviour and attendance improvement partnership work, because funding has to be agreed for this September to be devolved to schools. So there were 3 task and finish groups that met to carry out activities, and I think I'll go through each of those and summarise what the group leaders put forward, which is in the paper, and then Sarah can outline the LA response, and then we'll open up to any questions. So the Behaviour and Attendance Improvement Partnership BAPE lead was Christopher Bennett, who is the BAPE lead for the Huntingdonshire group. And for context, for colleagues who may not be aware, the BAPE agreement is the process where the local authority devolve an amount of funding from the high needs block to the 34 Cambridgeshire secondary schools to support them with inclusive practice. And that money has ensured that permanent exclusions in Cambridgeshire have historically remained very low, although have started to rise in recent years. So the proposal that was put forward seeks to support high quality provision, alternative provision, and retain the BAPE model, to work within the requirements of the safety valve, to ensure that inclusive provision is provided through secondary schools through the funding that exists, gives schools more flexibility around the use of Olive Academies for alternative provision, and provides a more secure funding model for Olive Academies, with the number of places that are actually used being commissioned. So the group looked at 3 elements. One was that the 500,000 that was diverted from the BAPE funding back to the high needs block in 2019 is retained by the BAPE and devolved to schools to help support inclusive practice. And that would be at a cost to £500,000 next year and in subsequent years to the high needs block. So that was recommendation number 1. Recommendation number 2 was that the additional cost of Olive places for next year, rising from 70 to 104, was going to be borne by the schools who commission the places. So overall, that would mean that schools who commission places would pay back £3,269 to the local authority back into the high needs block. And for schools, that would be offset by the fact that Olive have reduced their top-up placement this year. So the overall additional cost for an Olive place for schools for 25-26 would be £865 in addition. So that was recommendation 2. And recommendation 3 was that over time, the cost of the base funding for schools using the Olive places would be paid back by schools to the local authority and the high needs block. So over time, that would contribute to a reduction in the spending and costs of the high needs block and support that reduction in the overspend. And the details of that are set out in the table at the end of 2.1. And I don't propose to go through that in detail, but that information is there. The second element was around the enhanced resource bases. And this group was led by Peter Law alongside LA colleagues. And the main thrust of the recommendations in relation to the enhanced resource bases was that the rollout of the primary ERBs has been successful and should continue, and that the ERBs should sit within the continuum of provision that we'll talk about under 2.3. Collaboration with school leaders and the local authority around the memorandum of understanding and the KPIs for the new primary ERBs should continue. That the principles applied to the actions taken in the rollout of the new primary ERBs should be applied to a review of the existing ERBs in 25-26, and that proposals for existing ERB provision should be confirmed for implementation in 26-27. So that was in relation to the ERBs, the second task and finish group. And then the third task and finish group was led by Mary Abiasera and Alison Kramer supported that, and Michael Bateman and Martin Wade. And Mary's group have done a very clear piece of work that has outlined where different provisions sit on a continuum within Cambridgeshire. And you can see that in the diagram within 2.1 under the recommendations. And the recommendation is that we accept that there is a graduated provision offer, and we start to use a common set of language to work around that. And then there are a number of actions that flow from that continuum, which are outlined in the bullet points below around all of the different stages. So starting with agreeing what ordinary available provision looks like, all the way up to looking at how we ensure the right students are attending and accessing ISEPs, which are the most expensive part of our provision continuum. And the next steps with that recommendation are that the local authority officers will review the feedback and the recommendations and then report back. And then that there'll be a continued piece of work over the coming year to look at how we develop our common language, our knowledge and understanding of that continuum, and also the funding that aligns with those different levels on the continuum. At this point, before probably I hand over to Sarah to respond, I'm just aware if Mary, Christopher or Peter wish to add anything further in relation to their sections.
Thank you ever so much, Ryan, and thank you to all of those who led the groups. I know how much work's gone in, and I've obviously seen the notes that they've been being passed around and been in the steering group piece. It's a phenomenal amount of work from those who've stepped up from the sector, so to speak, but also for those of officers. I know you've got plenty to do on the way through, but the amount of work going into trying to make sense of what has become a massively complex problem, I think is absolutely laudable. So thank you for that. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything yet. Charlotte, Mary suggested you might want to say something, but I don't know whether you do.
Sorry, just trying to unmute. I'm happy to talk through the graduated approach if it's required, if anybody wants any further information, but I've nothing more to add other than what's already been explained. If anybody does want any further details, just come back to me. It's not a problem.
Brilliant. We'll probably take Sarah's response then and then see if that comes back later, Charlotte. Thank you. Peter, I see you've raised your hand.
Yeah, morning all. Really helpful summary, Ryan. Thank you very much. The only thing I would add regarding the secondary ERB provisions is we had a bit of a discussion about when's an ERB, not an ERB, in that the provision of ERBs is very varied in the secondary sector. So the primary model is a bit more homogenous, and the work to be done in the future regarding the secondary models might have some questions about clarifications about what constitutes an ERB, what doesn't, and how we approach those, because there's large discrepancies and large differences in the provisions.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I can see Ryan has raised his hand.
Yeah, just quickly in response to Peter said that there's a couple of things, Peter. I think one is that's where that principle of continuing to look and review moving forward, and there is a recognition of that complexity. And then you'll also see that in the continuum that's been put forward, there's been a distinction made between what's being called ERPs and ERBs, with ERBs being those places that traditionally exist in secondary schools where students are there and that's their main school and they remain on roll at that school, which is the case at Comberton as an example, and ERPs, which is more akin to what we're looking at in the new primary model, which is where children would stay on roll with the main school provider, but would attend the ERP, the Advanced Resource Provision, for 1 or 2 days and then return. And so that's seeking to kind of start to address that one of those discrepancies that exists, and that comes back to the use of commonly understood language as well.
Thank you very much. And Charlotte, you now do have a contribution. Excellent. Carry on.
Just in terms of point of clarity around the primary, it's looking at both models, not one or the other, just to be clear, that looking at the ERB and an ERP, and there being two very distinct pathways within primary. So it's about the development of both of those different facilities rather than that sort of ERP step in, step out kind of model.
Super. Thank you. Nikki.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to colleagues, as you've said, for all that hard work. I think particularly the the graduated provision work that's been done is really super helpful and gives a clarity that I think we haven't had before. But my question related to this idea of the ERP and the ERB, because I think where we are in the process of going out, for example, for consultation for colleagues to express interest in potentially running an ERB, we have been using the term ERB. And if we are then going to differentiate between an ERP and an ERB, I think we need to have a very, very clear framework of what exactly we mean by that, and what people are actually signing up for an expression of interest in, because they're potentially two very different scenarios.
Thank you, Nikki. Charlotte, is that a response to Nikki? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's part of the work that we've done in that work task and finish group, is about looking at really specific and clear KPIs and MOUs and putting in that definitive two pathway model so that people can be confident in what they're actually agreeing to provide or seeking to provide. And you may also, within that, there's the acknowledgement that you may have both in the same place. So you can have an ERB that is also an ERP, and there will be, depending on the different needs of young people, that have two different journeys. So there's been a lot of further detail and clarity. I'm aware that we're looking at sort of the second wave in relation to that, because obviously expressions of interest have already gone out with the original MOU and the original documentation. So there's further work that has come out as a response to the subcommittee work that we've done around it. And I think that clarity, that is being worked on, and should be coming out hopefully for the autumn term. But that is being undertaken by the EP rather than us as a working party. But we will loop back to that and look at that, so that they've had that input from education in terms of understanding the operational impact that may have on a setting or a school, and as a head teacher how you may or may not choose to want to pursue either of those. So we will continue to have that feed in, even though that piece of work is completed. There's a commitment there from panel members to continue to work alongside, to make sure that is fit for purpose, and it does reflect what we as forum members have asked for, which is in terms of being really, really clear around its purpose, the impact that we want it to have, and the I suppose at the end of the day, the value for money that is gained from having that provision within the local authority.
Smashing. Thank you for that, Charlotte. Are there any other colleagues, or shall we move? I think it's probably a timely point to move on to you. Thank you for waiting, Sarah. But it's nice to explore those items, and now we'll have the local authorities response.
Great. Thanks. Thank you, Mark. Can you see the screen? Okay. Has it come up?
No, I can see you at the moment, unless anybody else can see different. Sorry.
No,
I know you
don't
were
worry.
hoping I would say yes.
No, I was really hoping you'd say yes. Oh, wait a minute, it will do. There. Is it on the screen now?
Absolutely is, Sarah. I resisted the chance to say no.
Don't do that.
Behaved well, which is rare. Thank you, Sarah.
Perfect. Thanks very much. So I'm going to pick up, firstly, I do echo what everybody said. It's been it's really helped us move on this quite difficult piece of work by having the Ryan's chairship, but also having the direct engagement from schools within the subgroups. So going to the subgroups, so we've talked about the ERBs. As Ryan said, in terms of the BAPE, this is where we did need a pretty quick decision. We have had some quite difficult meetings, and I gave a commitment that the funding would not shift without further consultation, and that there would be a timeline into any changes. So the recommendations that Ryan's just shared, the 500,000 that was redirected as a result of the safety valve, we will be reinstating. So I'm confirming that we're supporting recommendation 1 in Ryan's report, that the 500,000 will be reinstated. And then the second recommendation within the report, where we're saying the increase from 70 to 104 places in the Olive, we're supporting recommendation 2, that increase is met by the schools currently using Olive, and with the figures that Ryan's just described, so that the full costs are not fully met because the places have slightly reduced. But recommendation 3, and I know Richard's on the call, recommendation 3, we are going to press pause on that, because I think we need to fully understand the implications for schools that are accessing that support in terms of absorbing the full cost. So we need to work that element through. So I'm just saying recommendation 1, yes, fully supported. Recommendation 2, yes, fully supported. Recommendation 3, let's continue to look at what the impact of that would be, because I don't feel comfortable saying that we are delivering a programme of inclusion for all, and then potentially those schools who are inclusive are impacted by carrying the full weight of that cost. So I think we need to do some further work on recommendation 3, but it's been a really, really helpful piece of work. So I'll come to the special school funding as we go through, and Charlotte, you might want to come in there.
Sarah, sorry, just as a quick question, is it a good idea to stop after each point and wait if anybody wants to comment on the BAPEs rather than carrying on now?
Yeah, cool. Although that means I have to try and share it again. Yeah, that's fine.
No, it's still sharing. It's still there. I can still see your screen. So I just thought it might be a point for if anybody wants to comment on the BAPE piece of work or respond, it's probably do them in the order. So is there anybody who wants to say anything about that information and feedback? Richard.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and I appreciate obviously the feedbacks that's gone back, because for me, I think the school level modelling of impact, particularly when talking about S19 responsibilities, there's an alternative financial model of impact with the local authority if the BAPE doesn't work and doesn't exist. And I know that certainly the context that I serve is likely to generate more costs for the local authority ultimately. So I really appreciate that consideration, and would say that I'm more than happy to work closely with the local authority on how that could look like in terms of embedding those inclusionary practices. So thank you very much for that, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much. Helena, I see your hand too.
Thank you. Yeah, really appreciate, as everyone said, all of the contextual detail that's been shared. I think what would be helpful for Cambridge secondary heads, we met this week, is just linking back to Richard's point about the modelling and the financial modelling for each school, but just a bit of clarity, because there's lots of different figures within the document around the impact on the cost of olive commissioning. I don't know if Ryan's able to answer in real terms, what are we saying? Because it talks about the uplift and it talks about the sort of base funding. But in order to consider how viable financially it's going to be, what are we saying in terms of what is it actually going to cost a school to commission an olive place with the recommendations going through next academic year and beyond? Thank you.
Yeah, of course, Ryan, answer. Yeah. Answer when you've come off mute, though, would be really...
that will help, won't it? So the total cost will be the 17,220 plus the chargeback by the local authority for the additional places, which is circa about £3,000. I haven't got it in front of me. So the total cost for an olive place next year for a school will be about £20,400 compared to 19,666 for schools. However, it's important to recognise that all schools next year will receive a proportion of the additional BAPE funding for next year, and that works out at about an 11% increase. Now, that will vary depending on school demographics, because obviously the funding is proportional. So schools that are larger and serve larger areas of deprivation get more funding. But broadly speaking, all schools will receive an 11% uplift. So the cost of the additional cost to schools for commissioning an olive place will be covered with some surplus next year for schools.
Thank you, Ryan. In real terms, because of the sort of BAPE commissioned places, am I right in thinking that schools have in real terms spent about 10k this year if they've used one of the BAPE commissioned places, though?
That I don't understand. There are no BAPE commissioned places. All places are commissioned by schools directly.
There are certain numbers, for instance, of ESKIP schools that have a subsidised total cost.
Not from an olive perspective. So the local authority pay the £10,000 base funding for 70 places, and then the top up is paid by whoever commissions a place. There is no subsidy. It's just what it costs.
Okay. So we're talking 20k per place.
Yes, correct.
As sort of being fairly cost neutral.
Yeah, so across the board, but schools will get more in their BAPE pot this year than the increased cost of a place. So schools will be better off this year. The longer term discussion is the one Sarah said about what we do about the base funding and how that's going to be managed longer term. The second thing to remember, of course, is that in commissioning with Olive dual registered, the mainstream school retains the ORPU, and that so you've got that to factor in as well. So that's 5,500 remains with the mainstream school. So in real terms, an Olive place is costing a school probably next year about £15,000. And then you're going to see a slight uplift in your BAPE funding of 11%. And I think Sarah's committed to sending an email to all secondary heads this afternoon, just giving that as a broad message. And Martin and the team will work on the details at school level to come out hopefully before the summer.
That's helpful to know. Thank you. I think the conversations that were happening at eSkip earlier in the week, 28k was the figure that was being used. So it's helpful to understand.
So that's much longer term, and that's what Sarah's talking about putting a pause on, because as Richard's alluded to, the schools that are in the most challenging areas and have the most challenging cohorts, by definition, use Olive more than everyone else, and therefore will be more adversely impacted if we push the total cost of all places. And I think Sarah's suggestion of pausing and using some of the modelling that Christopher and the group have done to help further discussions next year and early next year, so we have clarity moving forward, is a really sensible one, whilst also supporting schools now so that they're not adversely affected and creating more AP capacity in the system.
Yeah, certainly if you're geographically distant from those provisions as well, you've got to factor in transport.
That's also a challenge. Yeah,
you get less devolved funding from the BAPE in the first place, so a single place could become quite challenging to afford within that model. Thank you.
There is going to be more devolved funding into the BAPE, though. That's the point for this year and moving forward to that 500,000. So there is more money going into the BAPE pot, and it's resetting back to 2019.
Okay, thank you. Nikki.
Hi, can I just ask, it's a question for Sarah really, given the fact that we have got a picture of rising permanent exclusions within primary, whether this model still enables us to have enough resource within the local authority to meet the needs of those primary pupils who are, there isn't a BAPE model at primary, but still require provision.
Well, Nikki, I suppose the difference is we still have to do what we have to do, don't we, in terms of a local authority when after the 6 days. But it's just the model is different, isn't it? So if the primaries wanted to pursue the same model, we just have to, obviously the responsibilities would shift, wouldn't they? So it's not necessarily that it would create more money. It's about looking at where that money sits. So if we wanted to look at a primary BAPE model, it would be just about then thinking how the funding would then sit with the primaries, and they would have responsibility for securing that provision as the secondaries do now. So it's not necessarily going to impact on the funding for primaries. It's just that the delivery model is different, isn't it? It's something we can explore as if you think it's a useful thing to explore at CPH, Nikki, in terms of a proposal going forward. But I think your blunt message is that 500,000 going to be out of the budget for primaries? Is that what you're thinking?
sort of in a roundabout way, it's the fact that we are struggling in terms of children who've been excluded. So, for example, within our cohort, we've got one young person who's been out of school since October, and the struggles around, tuition packages, getting him into school, etc., etc. And often the response that we have is that there isn't the resource available and financial packages, etc. And I just think that this sounds like a fabulous model in terms of what it will do for secondaries, but it's about whether there is still going to be sufficient resource for those children who don't sit within a BAPE model, which at the moment is primary, to be able to meet their needs as well. And I'm not suggesting that primaries are looking at a BAPE model. It's more just, is the local authority confident that with this model, they will still be able to meet the needs of all of those children in Cambridgeshire who are at risk of exclusion, not just secondary pupils?
Well, I suppose it comes down to we have no option but to do that. And I think that the funding, that the 500,000 is not being pulled away from primary funding. I suppose what might be useful, Nikki, is to look at AP as a discussion point in CPH more generally, to see, should we do that? Because I agree that, I mean, there's pressures in all parts of the system, isn't there? So maybe we should look at what are the trends, patterns emerging in terms of primary, what's our current capacity to meet them, and could we do something more impactful? So maybe that's an action we could pick up to explore. But in terms of the funding, this funding is not being diverted away from primaries.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, all.
Shall I continue?
Yeah,
Sorry.
absolutely. I was just going to say thank you both to the local authority and the officers for the work, but also people's input there and the amount that's gone on. I was one of those who goes back to the beginning of the BAPES over a decade ago. I think it's been a fantastic thing for Cambridgeshire. It really sets us apart from a lot of other counties. It's got more and more complex, as we all know, over the last period of time. It's fabulous to watch people trying to work together to keep something that's worked so well for young people. So thanks for colleagues for that, and thank you for the rationality that people are dealing with, the complexities. We know the pots aren't big enough to cope with all of the challenges that we've got. What we're trying to do is our very best to make it equitable wherever we can, to give everybody a fair chance and all young people the best go they can. So thank you for that. I thought really complicated discussion, beautifully managed by everybody. So cheers for that. Sarah, yes, please carry on.
Thank you, Mark. So I think the conversation so far has identified the fact that we do need to land a proper timeline for the decision making, don't we? So obviously we've made some pragmatic decisions about BAPE so that we can move forward and people are confident about their funding. But we've already touched upon the enhanced resource bases and the need to have a clear timeline. So what this presentation aims to do, I think, drawing from the work that's happened so far, it's to identify some principles that have emerged from that work. So before I get into what they are, it's important and it picks up on the conversation we've just had really about the available funding, because the sum of the high needs block is 114,000. So if we're 114 million, so if we're that's quite a significant difference. And in terms of the different work strands within it, as we're going through this, as you might expect, each of those work strands are identifying that the current funding pot is not sufficient. So I guess going back to that need to have a clear timeline, when we make a decision about one of those funding streams, obviously that's going to be impacting on the other work streams because it's all coming out of the same pot. So when we're making the decisions, we need to be mindful of the safety valve agreement. So obviously we have to report to the Department for Education around the £63 million cumulative deficit in the dedicated schools grant that Martin talked through at the last meeting. So that's a constraint that we have to operate within. We also want to deliver this within the umbrella of inclusion for all. So going back to the conversation we just had about the BAPE funding, we need to be thinking, are the decisions that we're proposing in line with the principles of inclusion for all? So we've got to think about the money, but also, is it actually improving the experience for children and young people with SEND? Because if those two things are entirely at odds, then obviously, we might be making some sensible financial decisions, but we're actually making the situation for children worse. The other consideration is obviously our Ofsted report. So that was published on May 13th. I think we talked at the last meeting about the 5 areas for development. So they've obviously got to feed into our thinking. And also the SEND reforms. So all the mood music nationally around the SEND reforms, which now we're expecting autumn 25, although there's no firm deadline on that. All the sort of mood music is that EHCPs may be restricted to children with most complex needs in specialist settings. So again, if that's an imminent change, and we don't know at this moment, but if that is an imminent change that's going to happen, we're obviously having to consider the work that we're progressing against those imminent changes. So to make that more straightforward, I suppose if the ambition is that only children in specialist provision have EHCPs, it will be sensible for us to be thinking, well, how are we getting on the front foot of that and ensuring there's sufficient funding in our mainstream, our AP, our ERBs, because that's where those children who will no longer potentially have an EHCP will have to be supported. So that has to be a consideration whilst we're going through this piece of work. I won't reiterate what we've just said about the BAPE, because I think I've just confirmed the recommendations there. But this is the piece of work that was developed by Mary, the continuum. And I think this is fantastic. As Mark said at the beginning of the meeting, it's a really clear visual that describes the principles underpinning our approach. So ultimately, we want to have most of our support shunted to the left, don't we, in terms of providing support for children earlier on, especially if we think the national direction of travel is going to align with that. So in terms of the piece of work in the high needs block, then we've got to think about the funding being weighted at that side rather than being weighted at the high cost independent provision. We're never going to get to a position where we'll have no dependency on independent provision, but obviously the expectation is that we'll have more children's needs met without that dependency. So I know you wanted me to pause at different points, Mark, but I'll just get to this. I thought we had oh no.
Absolutely fine. They were quite distinct items, weren't they, really, Sarah, the BAPE, and then I think the ERP and their appearance in here. So carry on.
Okay, I'll plough on, but this is the most pertinent bit I wanted to share, really, alongside the diagram that I've just shared. So if we're thinking nationally, it's likely that EHCPs will only sit in specialist provision. And in the aspirations of the high needs block, we want to have sufficient funding to enable children to remain in mainstream where possible, or at least lower down that continuum. Then I guess there's a principle that as we move across that continuum, your expectation would be that as the complexity of need escalates, your assumption would be that the funding also escalates. That might sound like a bit of a no-brainer, but when Mary has undertaken this work and then we've applied the figures to those different elements, it isn't actually the case. So there's some anomalies that appear as you put in the funding into each of those work strands along the continuum. So I guess a question for Forum would be, do we accept as a principle that we would think there would be more funding to support the greater complexity of need? On that, I mean per pupil funding, because our aspiration would be obviously that we have sufficient funding in mainstream, in AP, in the ERBs to enable us to support those children who may no longer have an EHCP. And then I suppose the other question in terms of the principles underpinning the work is that we've also got to think that there's a cap on the funding that we have. So I've talked about the entirety of the high needs block being 114 million. We know that it's under considerable pressure. We also know that as we're getting more information coming through on each work strand, that the funding is potentially insufficient. So we're going to have to consider what's our prioritization process, so that when we're clearly saying, okay, there's insufficient funding to support the special school banding, it's going to require some further investment. There's an implication for that investment. So I suppose my ask is that as we work through this work in the high needs block subgroup, we will have to produce a rationale that says there's insufficient funding, the rationale underpinning an increase in investment is this, this, and this, and there'll probably have to be some similar principles or considerations that we're applying to each work strand so that we can make clear and consistent decisions. So just coming back to the special schools on that, and Charlotte, you might want to come in, but as we've gone through the special school banding, we know that some schools are going to have increased funding, and some schools are going to have a decrease in funding. Where the schools have a decrease in funding, it's sometimes the schools that are really currently struggling in terms of deficits. So again, I suppose my thinking there is we're going to have to work that through, because I know there's been a separate proposal, and this is just a pragmatic way, I think, of trying to think, well, if the banding doesn't land right, should we have a sort of blanket figure per place? And then when the need is such that it's in excess of that blanket figure, there'll be a kind of panel, peer panel, that then agrees an increase in funding. That's got its issues and challenges as well. So I guess where we are right now is we're going to have to support the schools that have got significant deficits and look at how we support them in the immediate. And then I think we've got to work through the implications of the banding and the alternative base funding approach. And so in terms of timeline, I think we support the schools that are in deficit now, working towards April as a way of landing what's the approach we're going to adopt in terms of banding, or are we going to go to that blanket, everybody gets this much, but there'll be a panel process where you can say that's insufficient because this child's got this complexity of need. There's pros and cons to both of them, and they're quite significant pros and cons. So we need to work that through. But the first thing we need to do is support the schools that are really, really struggling in terms of deficits. So I suppose the other bit I was going to say is local authorities, the decision maker for high needs block, but we have agreed it through Inclusion for All. We're a system, we're working in a joined up way. It's a very complex scenario that we're operating in. We can either work against each other or we can work with each other. I think the high needs block subgroup is illustrating the power of us working together. So I guess what I'm saying is that the high needs block will continue, as Ryan has done today, to make recommendations. Ultimately, the local authority is the decision maker. So the process would be, let's work it all out in the high needs block. Let's present the recommendations for consideration at schools forum. Local authority respond. go back to high needs block. So there's a continued dialogue, and it has to be genuinely transparent and collaborative. And I think we are working in that way, and I've found it incredibly helpful and useful. And I do think it's helping us to create much more stronger relationships. So yeah, so I think I've probably covered the fourth point, that Schools Forum will be that conduit, won't it? So we're saying, here's what's happening in high needs block. We bring it to Forum. This is where we're going with the recommendations. We do a response, goes back, high needs block. And I don't think I need to describe, this is just a very exciting visual that illustrates inclusion for all that you've probably seen several times before.
Okay. Considerable amount. I think Sarah's frozen for a moment. I don't know if colleagues have questions, comments, etc. that you would like to make. Hopefully while Sarah unfreezes. Charlotte. You're quite muffled, Charlotte. I don't know if everybody else is having the same effect.
Sorry, I'll come a bit closer.
Thank you.
It's my northernness, I apologise. I think it was a question for Sarah specifically, which was around, are we now looking at a further revised timescale in terms of the introduction of revised funding for special schools particularly? I think there is that absolute acknowledgement from special school heads that the pot is not sufficient and we cost a lot more than what we actually get at the moment, and providing that for monies for the most complex learners that we keep in-house is in itself just expensive. And I think that the very pertinent questions that Sarah's posed to us as a group around more complex, more money, question mark, and in terms of that continuum of provision across the board, you'll see that actually it peaks before it comes back down again, before it peaks again in terms of finances. And so I don't know if Sarah is unfrozen or online to answer the first question, which was around, is that another further revised timescale? Because that will take us to 2 years past the initial point of us being informed that we would get revised funding mechanisms as special schools. We were promised if it runs till 2026, we were told that the initial conception of the banding reforms was to be implemented for April 2024. So we will have been, 2 years in limbo at that point.
Okay, thank you. I'll just see whether Sarah's in a position to be able to answer yet. If not, I'll note that one down.
Yeah.
And then come back. Yeah, looks like the moment I'm not seeing Sarah coming back in. I don't know, Tamar, if you've got any connection to be able to check.
It looks like she's just left. I think she'll probably try and come back in a minute.
Okay.
Yeah, she's so.
I read those lines out about technical difficulties, and I don't expect I'm ever actually going to have to think about it. But maybe I am in a minute.
Yeah, it's okay. I'll just see if she's able to get back on.
Okay. If I store that as around a time frame question, Charlotte, and then
Thank you.
we can hear what Leslie would like to say and John, and then I'll try and collate that back together in a moment. Leslie.
Thank you. I mean, there's tremendous work being done, which is really great. So thank you to everybody involved. I just wondered, and I don't know whether primary colleagues would support this. I wondered whether we needed a briefing for primary schools because there's a huge number of primary school heads with different challenges. And I just feel that it would be great for them to hear this firsthand and for us to debate it and also to share more widely what is happening, because I think there's a great change in what is happening in our primary schools, which is going to have a knock-on effect for everybody in the future. I just wondered what other people felt about that, and I'd really welcome it. And I think, listening to people who know what they're talking about across the whole system, because we're at the start, would be helpful, because I think we're fixing the top, but we're not looking at what's coming before. open question to others.
Thank you. I think, Sarah, if you're back, aren't you? I think
I'm back. Yeah, maybe it was a convenient time for me to go, but
no, the two. I think I saw you listening to most of what Leslie was saying there. There's really one which is around a primary and how are we sharing that and how are we engaging with our primary colleagues. And the other question that came from Charlotte was, is this an announcement of a delay in the timeframes for implementing changes to special school banding? Hopefully that's kind of, Charlotte, what you were asking in a real nutshell.
are you waiting for Charlotte to come back in, Mark?
No,
Oh,
I
right.
think
No, that was what I was asking. That was what I was asking. And I suppose in addition to that, the follow-up is, and you spoke about immediate support for schools where there is a deficit, what the intention is and the plans are around that. So
Yeah.
is it an announcement of a delay in timescale around implementation, which if it's going to run until April 2026 will mean that is 2 years after we were initially informed that we would get revised funding mechanisms, and B, what is the immediate support, what are the plans on that deficit support?
Yeah. So the issues are, Charlotte, in terms of the the issue. So in terms of the banding, obviously, when we've looked at it, and it's not a perfect science, is it? But as you know, when we applied the actual figures to the needs, it didn't necessarily look like everybody had anticipated it might look like, and some schools were significantly impacted. And because we have to then trigger the minimum funding guarantee, it kind of distorted the whole process, because so basically, say you're a significant loser. Sorry, and don't take that the wrong way. So if you have a significant reduction, but then it's obviously supported through the minimum funding guarantee, and vice versa, if you're in a significant winner, then the process itself becomes completely artificial. So the only way around that is to apply for a disapplication of the minimum funding guarantee. And we can't apply for a disapplication for the minimum funding guarantee that would kick in within our timelines. So where that's taken us to is you can, and it's on the slideshow, which is you can say, actually, this is about the same process, but it's just responding to a shift in need. So I guess what I'm saying is we've got to work it through, because the banding modelling, if we have to apply the MFG, becomes completely artificial and doesn't support the schools that we set out trying to support, as in being a more equitable process that is needs led. So we've no option but to think, right, okay, well, we can't rush that through because it's not going to land where it's going to land. So what we've got to do is say, but in the interim, some schools are just not going to be viable unless we work with them. What that working looks like, Charlotte, obviously I can't just say, and that means we'll be doing A, B, and C. We need to work that through, but it's just, so I suppose but the answer to your question, yes, we're having to consider the timelines, because the banding hasn't taken us to where we need it to be, and when you reapply the MFG, it just distorts the whole process. And if we want to we want to apply for a disapplication, we can't do it in that timescale. So that's where ultimately we are.
Okay, and then there will be further, I'm assuming from what you've just shared, Sarah, that we can expect further information for schools that are in an individual deficit position around support mechanisms.
Yes. Yeah, and definitely. And I've spoken to Martin about that.
Okay, thank you. That's really useful. I think it's important that we get that out to colleagues ASAP, so that they can make, significant kind of strategic decisions around the next academic year, from a financial point of view. So I will share that. Thank you for your candour around that.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Now I'm just going to check with John, Christine and Yolanda. are you continuing this discussion or moving to a different one? Different one. Because if that's the case, I'll move on to Leslie's question about primary and then come through your hands in a second. Okay, thank you. I don't know if you had anything in response, sorry to say in response, Sarah, to Leslie's points about how it's communicated and primary colleagues are engaged.
Yeah, so Leslie, sorry, because I was just coming back on the call when you were talking. So just give me a clear steer in terms of for primaries, what specifically are you saying in terms of understanding the timeline and engagement within the process? Is that what you mean?
Yes, I just think it would be really helpful to have a briefing with all primary heads.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, no matter what structure they're in, because I think sharing that the idea that people, are putting things together, there's things happening, but also just listening to what the challenges are in schools. And I think, primary heads are really good at coming up with solutions, aren't they? And I think there's a lot of confusion around the ERP, the ERBs, and who's doing what and how's it's funded and etc. So I do think clarity at this point would be beneficial in the long run. And I just wondered if other colleagues thought that time.
So maybe we can commit to bring something to the CPH meeting if Nikki's supportive in September. I don't know if you have one scheduled for September, Nikki, or that goes through this continuum of need work and what the implications are, what the timescales are, what we're trying to achieve. Would that be the sensible way forward?
Sarah, I think what Leslie's alluding to is maybe that it needs to come directly to heads rather than via CPH reps, because I think and it also needs to contain the sort of detail that, for example, that Helena was talking about very specific figures in terms of financial impacts, etc. So I'm not sure that CPH reps would necessarily have the level of detailed understanding to be able to then cascade that down to colleagues. So I think it might be better as a more direct and specific briefing, but that contains real detailed information about the financial or other impact that some of this work will have inevitably in primary schools.
So that I don't then undermine the process that we've just established, I'm wondering if the sensible thing, I know John's going to come in, but I'm wondering if the sensible thing, John, Mark, is we pull something together that the sector-led reference group, which has the chairs on, do we look to produce something in that group that everybody thinks, yeah, that does it, and then it gets circulated? Because I just think we run a risk of undermining. We've started to create quite a useful structure through the high needs block subgroup and through the sector-led reference group, and we all know that communication is critical and it can go a bit awry. So I'm just thinking, having invested in those new processes, that might be the way to do it. But I know John's got his hand up and he might have something to say about that.
I'm happy to come in at that point. Mark.
Yeah, very sensible. Yeah, please, John.
That was my point. I'll first of all just echo what everybody said at the start, really, in terms of thanks to the various people who've actually led on these different work streams. It really is quite impressive in a sense of moving forward. Yeah, that was my point, really, Sarah, getting that communication right and actually over communication. So it actually speaks to what Charlotte was saying and Leslie as well. And so very happy for the first meeting we'll have in September, which we discussed earlier on this week, to actually plan that very structured approach to over communication, and actually also come back to something Charlotte said as well, making sure that we're actually achieving certain deadlines by which decisions we made. Otherwise, given the uncertainty around the white paper as well, which I referenced in the chat, it's quite possible for these deadlines and sort of checkpoints to slip. So we need to make sure that's built in, and to make sure that we're taking people with us, because there's clearly going to be winners and losers. We're still talking about the same jam jar in terms of funding, and therefore we need to make sure we're over communicating as much as possible. So yeah, completely agree, Sarah, and perhaps after this we have a kind of offline conversation about how to set up that first meeting of the sector reference group to put that timeline into place, which clearly then impacts upon the different sector groups, CPH, CSH, etc. So that's the first thing I was going to say. Can I move on to the second thing, Mark?
I think so, John.
Okay, thank you. This is a very quick thing. And I think you've kind of said to us before it's not possible, but one of the constraints in which you're working is the safety valve agreement. As far as I'm aware, unless I've missed this, that has never been shared with us. And I think before it's been spoken about, it's a top secret document between the local authority and the DfE. I think in order to make sure we have the full context, and because we are working in a very collaborative way here, local authority and schools, if there was some way in which that could just be put out there so we kind of know what the implications of that are as well. I think that would be useful, but that's more of a technical issue.
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. So I'll take that away and I'll talk to both the Martins and see how we can share that, because obviously if I'm proposing, look, this is a constraint we need to work in, then you need to understand, well, what does that actual constraint mean? So yeah, I'll take that away and talk to both of them and see how we can frame that.
Smashing. Thank you very much, both. And I think hopefully that deals with the comms and how we share that back, and it's kind of extrapolated out from primary into how do we manage that flow throughout the sectors. So thank you for that all. Yolanda.
Yes, thank you for that. What I wanted to raise, and I can obviously see, just to remember that students' needs don't end at 16. So as I'm here as the post-16 rep, that's really what I wanted to highlight, that students are progressing onto a range of different organisations and their needs also need to be considered as part of this debate. I fully appreciate that the local authority has an enormous challenge, an absolutely enormous challenge, as does everybody, which is managing, dealing with more need with less money. I totally appreciate that. But I just wonder if we can just, in the communication and in our debates, also remember that students are progressing on to a variety of providers following all kinds of different courses from pre-level 1 to level 4 in some cases, etc. Thank you very much.
Super. Thank you very much, Yolanda. Anything you wanted to reply to that, Sarah, or is there anyone else who has a further question?
Only that it's a very good reminder, Yolanda, because obviously from a SEND perspective, it's up to 25, isn't it? And one of the areas for development from the Ofsted inspection was that inconsistency in terms of the transition. So absolutely, I wonder if an action could be that we consider that in terms of our continuum of need approach. So, but thank you. Yes, we need to ensure that it is thought into the funding, but also the support.
Thank you very much indeed. And I see Nikki's put the fund and safety valve agreement in the chat as well. So it's there if anybody wants to get hold of it. So thank you. I'll just pause for a second. Is that another comeback question, or is that the old famous legacy hand?
That's a legacy hand. I can come with more questions if it helps, but I'll take it down.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Okay, so our recommendation was we review and look at the questions and the content of the report. We don't have any vote to pass on that. I'll just reiterate again and thank you for the colleagues that have taken so much time, energy and effort. I think everybody's acknowledging we're by no means out of the woods, and people have already identified white papers and the potential delays for them and the confusion that's causing us as a sector. As many of us have pointed out to regional directors and the like, it's us who are on the front line with the parents in front of us wanting to know what's happening for their young people. It needs to be quicker so that we can actually find some solutions for them, because it's not fair to leave us out there as long as it has been so far. We'll move on then, unless there's anybody else with a hand up, we'll move on to item 5, the Schools Forum Agenda Plan. Tamar, are there any changes to the forward plan?
Not that I'm aware of.
Super. And if you're not aware of them, I presume that means that they don't exist. Therefore, we can accept that piece. Again, there's nothing there other than if there's comments that people would like to make on that. I have one other little item just to share. It was an item which we'd taken as an action before. I think it's planned for somewhere in the middle of September, the MPs meeting that we've described, where we will refer all of the information that we've been sharing today through with them. Martin Wade has texted during this meeting. He's at an F40 conference this morning, and he was going to share some materials that they are going to be producing. I think that will help us in our campaign to get MPs to really understand the kind of pressures that we're living in at this point. So just to let you know, we haven't forgotten about that. We had to wait for all the elections, and then obviously the summer interlude where we're not able to get everybody together. I think it's about the 20th of September from recollection. We will have that meeting, and we'll very clearly represent the frustrations and concerns that we've shared on the way through this meeting. Sarah, I see you've raised your hand.
Yeah, sorry, Mark. I just remembered an AOB. I just thought it would be useful to share that we have finally had a commitment to support some additional capacity across the SEND team. We're still working out the whole practicalities of what that will look like, but it's just a really positive endorsement, I think, from the council that, you know, the impact that you are experiencing in your schools in terms of the timeliness of our processes, we will be able to now look to bring in some additional capacity to support that. So it was a positive piece of news to get that there's been an agreement in principle to the proposals that we've put forward to manage those capacity issues.
Okay. Thank you for that, Sarah. I think after a long, difficult year with much complexity and challenge, it's really nice to end on a positive note where we've been able to get more support for helping most vulnerable. Thank you, colleagues, for all your support and hard work during the year. I hope you have wonderful summers planned ahead. Hope there are no more last-minute announcements coming our way that will make things any more complicated than they have been. And those who are stepping down from Forum today, as Tamar listed before, thank you ever so much and best wishes with all that you go on to do. I think most of those stepping down are stepping into new horizons. So I hope they bring wonderful things for you. And I hope you don't forget that school governance is a wonderful thing. And I'm sure there are many other people that love to see you taking on a role in that kind of thing. Just saying. Anyway, thanks ever so much, everybody. Have a wonderful summer. We'll see you the other side. Thank you.
Thank you.